Kelly, and you're listening to General Intellect Unit. This week we're picking up part 2 of our discussion of Organising for Power by Amelia Davenport. If you didn't catch the first part, I'd recommend pausing this episode, going back one, and starting from there. As always, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy the show. Yeah, I was just thinking that, like, the whole primitivism bit is the other sort of looming answer to the social division of labor problem. It's like the Kaczynskiite fucking thing of, like, oh no, like, just the lever is where it all went wrong. It's time to go back to fucking telepathic thought or whatever, or banging rocks together to make fire.
That does get addressed a little bit in this essay in terms of talking about, like, the frontiersmen, right? You know, well, let's really think about what that's all about there.
Which does bring us on to the next section then. This is all about the petty bourgeoisie and organising, right? Like, and it's about the we're kind of fast forwarding to the present moment, right? And, like, starting to refocus this on, like, you know, building in the now, right? In more so than just analysing past forms of improvement to the organisation process. Contrasting, like, you know, these kind of two broad groups, right? The intelligentsia and skill labourers, and the professional organising class versus the kind of unskilled masses of proletarians. And this is going to be a problem in both capitalism and socialism. So we have to be really fucking careful and think seriously about this problem.
Right. And, you know, this is like the people on the one hand who benefit from monopolization of technique versus the people who are oppressed by their lack of technique. This, you know, it is certainly a present concern. But the sort of first analysis that Davenport points to is a book that was written by a Wobbly member of the International Workers of the World, Austin Lewis, in 1912. So what Lewis said was that, you know, much of what we call the working class is actually petty bourgeois. And I'm not sure exactly what the definition Lewis was using of petty bourgeois is, but I think essentially what he's saying is that there are a number of workers who may not actually derive a significant portion of their income from capital ownership, but they do have kinds of properties and monopolies, particularly skill monopolies, that they rely upon to get a premium in their salaries over their salaries, income, whatever, their revenue, over other workers. And, you know, the way in which you can kind of say that these people are petty bourgeois in some cases is like they may be actually independent contractors or artisans, right? And so they do have a very different relationship to capital. It's a kind of indirect one versus, you know, a worker who is just completely subsumed into like a temp organization or a large corporate bureaucracy. But that's not really the core of what they're talking about here. The core is having these skill monopolies.
So this is to touch back on the Weber stuff, like via understanding class. This is the kind of opportunity hoarding angle on class division, right?
Yes, and it is. You know, when people talk today about the professional managerial class, this is generally what's being discussed here. These people as being petty bourgeois.
Yeah. And the author then touches like specifically on kind of like Marx's predictions for what the expansion of industrial machine stuff would do to these kind of like pre-industrial skill artisan sort of based workers and work processes, the kind of assumption was that the getting chewed up in the machinery of capitalism would turn them all into proletarians, right? Like would all flatten it out.
Right.
But what we kind of actually see in practice is a couple of different ways of quote solving this problem for these skilled workers. On the one hand, forming craft unions to basically defend skilled monopoly, and what's the other one? Then the other hand is becoming the managers and the engineers and the accountants and so on, which are kind of really embedding themselves in the new relations of capitalism, right? That's on the one hand, you have the craft unions kind of trying to maintain this kind of autonomy and skill autonomy, right? Like a kind of distance from the blender of capitalism, and the other one being to just completely lean into it and subordinate oneself to these forces, but in a way that's still beneficial. You get your middle rung on the ladder.
Yes, and importantly, that second group, for I guess our audience it does include computer programmers. So let's drill a little bit into what these categories are based on. So the first one, the craft unionists. These would include people like bricklayers, teachers, electricians, nurses, etc. So some of these people, like the bricklayers, come from the old artisanal strata, right? They had that skill, and then instead of defending their skill monopoly on an individual basis as an artisan, they formed craft unions in order to defend that skill monopoly as a group, as a collective. Now, of course, artisan guilds already existed in feudalism, but, craft unionism is something that's a little bit broader than that in terms of scope. So these people tend to fetishize autonomy and abhor the discipline necessary to achieve general freedom. These are Davenport's words. So, having been a teacher who's a member of one of these craft unions, right? I can talk a little bit about this. It is the case, despite what I said earlier about the sort of limitations of having autonomy over my classroom and just sort of being managed by initiative and incentive, there is a kind of interest as a teacher for defending your turf, for particularly as a post-secondary teacher, right? Just sort of saying no, my classroom is my classroom and I want to teach what I know, right? Not what the organization tells me to teach, but what I actually know in which I can teach the best, because that's where my skill lies. And I should be able to teach the way that I want to teach, as opposed to just being a cog in the machine, right? And so this kind of ideal of a great teacher using the classroom as this kind of isolated social space for the inculcation of skills and knowledge and curiosity and all of this kind of stuff is the kind of ideology that you see floating around among teachers, particularly, I think, among post-secondary teachers. Now, the case of teachers is a little bit complex because the power of the teachers' unions is very much under assault, and the social status of teachers is very much under assault. So it doesn't provide really a pure case for the power or for the sort of autonomy at its zenith of this group. But you do kind of get the idea, right, of why these why these groups think the way they do and what exactly it is they think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Indeed. There's an example here that digs into this kind of autonomy thing, right? That we get this contrast between a specialist surgeon and a frontiersman, and this is kind of this is a quoting Taylor, right, who'd use this kind of thing as an example, right? That and he was trying to make the point that the surgeon, their craft is more narrow and it's more controlled and so on, but it's not less free in any kind of like meaningful way, because like, you know, a frontiersman, whatever, oh, you know, this romantic vision of like, you know, you gotta just go out there and you can do whatever you want and this kind of shit. But then you're spending half your time fighting off bears, or the rest of your time is trying to like build a house, but there's no shit available to build it out of. You build it and it still falls down, all this kind of stuff. And it's like, are you actually better off having that kind of autonomy, right? The whole like free man on the range thing, or are you better off being a surgeon? Like it's, and like the challenges that the surgeon faces when they show up to work are interesting and, you know, fulfilling and so on, but they're not dangerous. Like, you're not going to get fucking eaten by a barracuda or something, you know, just randomly while you're going about your job. So it's kind of, again, undermining this romantic notion of autonomy as just being like completely unconstrained freedom. And getting a little bit towards the kind of beer direction of like, hey, meaningful autonomy does need structure to it. You know, you have to have a framework in which to be autonomous. And, you know, the sort of primitivist like thing of like, oh, I want to just be out there in the woods banging rocks together to make fire, and that's real freedom. It's like, not really.
Yeah. So what Davenport writes is that returning to individualist forms of labor wouldn't enable someone to develop fully or as they desire. Objective necessity, not individual inclination, determines their labor, and their labor relies on limited self-acquired knowledge and resources. Like, as someone whose parents, or who like my mother, did the whole back to the land thing, yeah, this really rings true, right? Like this is, yeah, there is a kind of pleasure to the lifestyle, but really you have to work so much harder because you're isolating yourself from that division of labor, the social labor.
Yeah. Also, like, your taskmaster is now a completely uncaring universe that just simply doesn't give a shit about whether you live or die in this storm or whatever. That's your new manager, right? Like, that's the one who's disciplining your fucking work.
And so, sort of like, importantly, this is being compared to the surgeon, because the surgeon's training and approach to their work is quite similar to the time and motion approach that Taylor advocated, right? Like, you know, they learn how to do specific cuts and specific procedures under the supervision of a trained surgeon, and there's a right way to do it, and they learn how to do that, and that's their job. And, you know, certainly it is narrow. Certainly it's not just like, oh, yeah, you know, you're just going to like freeform this operation for the most part.
I really don't want free jazz to be the fucking like structuring thing of my surgeries. Right?
Yeah, exactly. And you know, it is true that is quite limited. But the point that Davenport makes is like, well, yeah, but because of the social division of labor, the surgeon can get quite a bit of free time in which they can do other things of their life, right? They can pursue other interests, they can develop other capacities. Whereas if you are the, you know, sort of primitivist or the frontiersman who's, you know, notably living on land that has been taken through the genocide of indigenous peoples, which is a pretty like narrow historical horizon that you're living in there. Yeah, you're just being conditioned by objective necessity. And I guess, you know, if you're romantic about nature, that has a kind of appeal. But there's certainly a lot of times where it's like, I got to go chop that wood to get fire, or I gotta go, you know, draw water from the well and haul it across the farm over to the wash basin because I don't have any running water. They're not great. They're not great experiences.
Also, the frontiersman eventually ends up being his own surgeon anyway. And, but now you don't have any fucking tools to do it with. Like, yeah, great freedom you got there.
Yeah.
Exhausting. But this gets to something really important, right? Because this is still a thing, this kind of romantic pre-discipline sort of notion of autonomy. The variations on this back to the land thing are like unfortunately extremely popular, like throughout sections of the left, right? We have this kind of like popular regressivist sort of strain of anarchism, or the kind of like smallholder Proudhonist sort of thing, you know, all that kind of stuff, right? It's all in this kind of area of like advocating for being the frontiersman rather than the surgeon here.
Well, and, you know, I think this analysis is kind of insightful in a way culturally as well, because, you know, with the sort of rise of tech and the transformation of social space, of urban spaces, according to that, and sort of like the rise of things like, you know, craft breweries is like a kind of like space that is oriented towards members of this like quote unquote petty bourgeoisie. Like there's a lot of sort of like hearkening back to the artisanal, right? Like, oh, like it's bespoke, it's artisanal, it's, you know, it's a product of craft and handiwork and tradition and et cetera, et cetera. And it's like looking at it, you know, sort of at a distance, it's kind of like, well, what's the connection here, right? Like why is there such a fetishization of artisanal work in these groups? Why does that appeal so much? Well, the answer is because like these groups are like actually the successors of the artisans. So it's not a purely appropriative thing. It's kind of actually like reflecting a historical lineage and a common material interest and a common way of viewing the world.
Yeah. And like a commonality, the thing being that like you have to, for that to be the thing, you have to believe that nothing better could ever be possible. Like the only way to improve the situation is to turn backwards. You know, that like
it's kind of like the golden age reborn is sort of the ideal, right? It's like the artisans, but better, because you know we got like 400 craft beers on tap. Like they only had one.
that thing that used to be a big thing like 5, 6, 7 years ago, the whole like artisanal JavaScript stuff, which honest to God was a fucking thing. I was like, I'll never let anyone live that shit down. Dreadful stuff.
The beauty of the code.
Yeah. Anyway, there's a lot of that great stuff here, right? Like, and it's contrasted then with the other sort of camp, right? The other way of preserving this kind of elite stuff, which is to embed in the system and become the kind of managers, the engineers, the accountants, and the programmers, right? To
specifically, these are people, so managers, accountants, etc., programmers. They're people who have skills that are only useful in large-scale enterprises.
Mm-hmm. Even if they're consultants, it's still like, what are you going to do as an accountant except for, you know, serve these enterprises? Like you can't go to the accountancy farm and like grow your own accounts or whatever.
Well, and you can think about this as well with like programmers, right? Like it's like, oh yeah, like what are you going to do with your programming absent large organizations?
Mm-hmm. Especially if you're an AI person or like the machine learning stuff and whatever is like those data sets only exist in one place. Like what do you plan to do with your fucking shitty like 2015 MacBook or whatever? You're just gonna like, you know, do something that's equivalent to what Google's AI stuff is, whatever? No, you're gonna go work for Google.
Right.
That's
and
how it has to be.
You have things you can do like, oh, like DIY projects. Like I'm going to make a garage door opener that like I can log into over SSH and make it open, or I'm going to make a computer to manage my like individual craft brewing project. So there's these kind of hobbyist things, or there are like, you know, examples that are a little bit more like literally like artisanal work, like say like indie game development, right? But for the most part, these skills are just useful in large organizations. And that means that they have a somewhat different relationship to capital than the majority of artisanal petty bourgeois, right? Because they're not actually interested in autonomy strictly, because they're really more interested in being embedded into larger organizations.
There's a small hint of the artisanal stuff in that, like, the pursuit of, like, startups or whatever, or, like, accountants, we're going to band together and make our own firm or something. There's a little bit of that, but it's ultimately, like, it's the teleology of those things is still to establish another firm. The context is always the same.
Yeah, and this is a bit of a messy division, but it has a certain amount of political importance when we get into like what this implies. So, the key thing here is that artisanal and craft petty bourgeois bear the costs of business taxes and state regulations, making them conservative. So again, not universally the case, especially for teachers, generally not the case. Because they're obviously embedded in a larger organization, they're getting their funding from the state, blah, blah, blah.
I think that's the specific thing that Davenport points out is that when the exception is when the artisanal stuff is dependent on public spending, then they tend to skew much more liberal.
That's right. So for the most part, the artisanal and the craft petty bourgeois, they get their health care. So this is especially important in the American case, right? They get their health care through private or union plans. Remember, these are craft union plans. They're not industrial union plans. And so they don't support single payer healthcare. Again, this completely varies depending on how well that craft is or how well off that craft is in society, because you may not actually be able to make a go of it. I know people who are contractors who do this kind of artisanal work. They still support single player because they just don't make enough money to pay for the private plan themselves and still have a comfortable lifestyle. And generally, the artisanal and craft petty bourgeois are attracted to racism in order to defend their jobs against skilled immigrant labor. So again, we have like a very obvious case of this happening in the tech sector, right? Very obvious appeal to tech workers in America to ward off job competition from other skilled workers. The important thing here is, of course, like what makes their labor more valuable than the average schmuck is that they have a special skill. So the more people they get educated outside of the country, the less that skill is worth potentially. Mm-hmm. So racism is a strategy for dealing with that.
Yeah. With programmers, though, as well, we're seeing more of this kind of like these kind of naked attempts to get just more kind of like proletarian sort of labor into it, like with the boot camps and that sort of stuff, coding boot camps, to just churn out labor supply, which I found funny in the industry. A lot of people don't see that. Like it's like they don't kind of put two and two together that that's what's being done. It's a very uncritical sort of. And look, the flip side of that is that like these are often, also tied up with notions of getting underrepresented groups into the industry. So there's a couple of sides to this thing which make it a bit tricky. But there's obvious kind of like just inflating the labor supply stuff going on there to ultimately de-skill as well. And I found it very interesting kind of like picking people's brains on this and just observing, do they put two and two together as to the labor part of that, or is it just seen as being like an unequivocal good? Because like, it's just underadvantaged folks, they get in, it's great, which is good. This is kind of the tricky part, right? Because what we've been talking about all through this essay is spreading these skills far and wide, and raising people's aptitudes, empowering people all through society to do things. But in capitalism, this creates these contradictory dynamics, right? Where, because of the kind of brute evolutionary processes of the market and the labor market and stuff, you're put into this kind of tension of like, well, shit, if people get empowered in the thing I'm good at, then there's going to be a problem. And that's kind of like, that's why the emphasis has to be on this kind of like building this stuff into socialism. And like, we need a society that doesn't have those fucking contradictions, it doesn't have these incentives to hoard opportunity.
Yeah. And just to, not exclusively fling shit over the fence at somebody from another profession. You know, you can see how this happens with teachers too. For example, like with say, like, you know, I used to be an English teacher, an EFL teacher, and you know, my job was in competition with an English teacher from the Philippines who would teach online. And what's my real advantage there? Well, you know, you just kind of have to appeal to sort of like vague cultural prejudices, because at the end of the day, like, you can say like, oh, but I speak native English. that kind of thing comes up totally, a lot. Right? Because at the end of the day, in terms of learning the grammar and vocabulary and so on, there's really no benefit to hiring somebody like me at a higher rate than somebody in the Philippines. So yeah, I mean, this kind of stuff does not exclusively apply to programmers, and I wouldn't want to imply that in any way. It's just these pressures do exist when your lifestyle is dependent on this kind of like premium or monopoly.
Yeah, I mean, I keep picking on programmers because I am a programmer, and I'm fucking sick of the career in a way, you know, as well. And it's like there's so much to pick fault with that I can just have a field day with it.
Yeah. Right. So the conservative end is the people who are basically hit by business taxes and state regulations, because they have to interact directly with the taxation bodies and regulatory bodies. Right. They're kind of more independent, whereas the artisanal petty bourgeoisie that are dependent on public infrastructure, investment, and funding tend to be more liberal, for example, teachers. And generally speaking, what's happened in recent American politics is that whereas the artisanal petty bourgeoisie used to be kind of like the forefront of radicalism in the early 20th century, they've gone to the Republican Party, right? Like small government, blah, blah, blah. Build the wall, blah, blah, blah. And the organizational petty bourgeoisie, so the people who work in big organizations, have tended to go to the Democrats. So they're drawn to student debt forgiveness, single-payer health care, ending the gender pay gap, the Green New Deal. And one reason for this is that capital dominates them directly, and so they face less economic pressure from the state than other sections of the petty bourgeoisie. Basically, you're getting taxed on your salary. You're paying income tax. You're not paying business tax. You're not your compliance office in your organization deals with regulation. It's not something you have to deal with on the everyday basis yourself.
Mm-hmm. It's something just occurred to me. We could call back to way back, like years ago, with the episode on yeoman coders, right? Which and the Californian ideology stuff, which placed programmers and so on in the artisanal camp, and we detected problems with that. But we get the clarity here that no, they're not really in the artisanal camp; they're in the organizational petty bourgeois camp. And there's that's
yes, they're kind of in both, right? They kind of it's a muddy category. It's one foot in one foot in the other.
Indeed. And yeah, there's great points here about these being kind of respectively the voting basis for the Republicans and the Democrats.
Right, and this is important because it sort of clarifies the point that, like, well, when you look at American politics, for the most part, the working class does not vote.
Pretty much, right? It's voting is an elite phenomenon, basically.
And it's like, well, why does one section of the working class vote and the other section of the working class doesn't vote? It's because the people who vote are not proletarianized. They're people who have these, like, quote unquote petty bourgeois like monopolies, which give them a stake in these questions that the proletariat does not have.
Indeed. The spectre of proletarianization is important here, and the section kind of closes out with this remark that our movement has room for members of these layers, and we need their skills to construct the cooperative commonwealth, but only insofar as we win them to the proletarian camp. And some of that is going to be just kind of appealing to, hey, look, you're not really petty bourgeois. You're actually kind of at either already proletarian or at severe risk of falling into that category.
It's the constant risk that capital is going to find a way to break your craft or break your profession. That is a strong reason to argue for solidarity with the proletariat and not with capital. And it should be said, like, Shane and I are both members of this class. Mm-hmm. I assume most of our listenership is as well.
Yeah.
And so, this obviously applies to just like our self-understanding of where our political interests lie. And that's a good thing to have, because it's easy enough to say, like, I am a worker, at least, I can say I'm a worker, and that's not untrue. But what's the specific difference that makes me distinct from a proletarian who doesn't do like quote unquote skilled work? It's more accurate to say professionalized work, right?
Indeed, because it's all skilled, right? It's really important to grasp this sort of thing, right? Because I'm sure, like, I'm imagining a straw man in my head now, where I'm sure we've gotten shit somewhere for like appealing to these regressive petty bourgeois kind of elements. But I think we've been saying this all along. It's important to not just write people off because they're not making minimum wage, right? Like they're still mm-hmm. workers, and we can absolutely appeal to this like proletarian sort of interest of like, hey, if you're not already proletarian, and look, somebody like who's just writing code for like Rockstar or something in like an ocean of desks is probably a fucking proletarian, you know what I mean? If not already, then they're going to be soon, and like appealing to solidarity on that level, that has to be valid. It can't be a case of like, well, if you're not slumming it in the fucking streets with the rest of us, you're just a reactionary force by default. But you can't just do this kind of like, I guess, sort of Lassallean thing of like, or there are variants of socialism which try to do this like basically appeal to the aristocracy or whatever. Of like, oh, maybe the aristocratic layer will allow us to do socialism. That's horseshit as well. Like, we have to understand our class locations and really, work with them. Because that's the reality we have.
And so what, people in our position, what we have to look towards is not using our skills and knowledge as a special resource to sort of leverage the proletariat for our political ends. It's more about working towards our own abolition as a special class.
Indeed.
And so this kind of gets into the next section of the essay, which is about cultural revolution. Again, moving away from the so-called workplace and back towards the political, which is often privileged as a separate sphere of activity, which is, that's bourgeois ideology, but we shouldn't buy into it either, right? So quote-unquote revolutionaries, they also use knowledge monopolies to set themselves up as leaders. So, for example, Leninists will use their knowledge of like Trotskyist dogma to browbeat new activists, like, this is insufficiently revolutionary, this is bourgeois, this is an example of like capitalist roadism, or this deviation or that deviation, blah, blah, blah. And this totally happens. And of course, you can go listen to From Alpha to Omega or, something like The Regrettable Century to hear about, former Leninists sort of like talking about all of the abuse they've suffered in these kinds of organizations. Then you have another example that Davenport points to, which is anarchist authors who wage bitter fights against one another in the struggle to sell their postmodern, jargon-laden polemics against things everyone already knows are bad. So, the anarchist position is not so much about browbeating; it's more about developing like flame wars and controversy and generating notoriety on the basis of that. So that's like, you know, the Brooklyn leftist circuit
Yep.
of kind of like making a name for yourself politically by getting into one of these scraps. So when we go back to the Soviet Union, there's a lot of Soviet history in these sections, which we're kind of skipping over a bit because, you know, if you want to get into if you want to get into the particulars of like who suppressed whom and blah, 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 you know, please like go read the article. But, you know, it's kind of something that'll be of more interest to people who are like really into that history than people in general. So we're going to kind of skip over it to whatever degree we can. So in the Russian Revolution, you obviously had the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, right? And Lenin was the leader of the Bolsheviks, and the Mensheviks were led by Plekhanov. While they disagreed on a number of things, they did agree about the necessity of technical specialists as a class. So this meant that despite their commitments to liberation, which both of them shared, they reinforced technical domination. And one way they did this is by fetishizing Marxist theory as something that is apart from other forms of knowledge. And so you can see in this decision that they made, or perhaps it's an unconscious decision, but it's a tendency that developed out of their work, they laid the groundwork for those future Leninists to use their dogma to browbeat activists.
Mm-hmm. And it lays the ground for the just absolute fucking degeneration that we find ourselves in of like all these like received wisdoms just being unquestionable fetishes and like, and the special pleading, right, of like, oh no, Marxism is a special kind of science with a special epistemology. And it's like, it just fucking isn't. No. Like just, it's not some four-valued logic or whatever that's just fucking special in itself. It's just, do normal science, do ordinary sociology on this stuff with a class angle. That's all you need.
It leads to these kinds of closed discourses that create things like, for example, Trotsky's teaching young activists history about the Russian Revolution that is fabricated and false.
Simply wrong.
And if you went to read like a bourgeois history or just a general history of this subject from the academia with like current historiography and current knowledge, like that would just be disproven or not even entertained as an idea.
Mm-hmm. The other kind of insidious form of this, and I think this is kind of harking back to a conversation, an untaped conversation we had with Lexi from Swampside, but we also get the perpetuation of like really out of date notions and like things that were in fashion at the time. So is it with the whole like war of position, war of maneuver thing? Am I thinking of Gramsci there, or am I thinking of someone else? Right. So, but like, and I might be getting this a little bit wrong, but I think the gist is that Gramsci kind of advocates for going for the war of position. But even by the time he was writing that was already obsolete doctrine for the militaries, and they were coming around to the notion that war of maneuver was vastly more favorable. But Gramsci was reading books that were already out of date in a subject he wasn't a fucking expert on. And then we've got fuckers running around here in the 2020s regurgitating this shit as if it wasn't completely fucking invalid. Oh my God, like how could we be doing this to ourselves? It's crazy, you know?
Well, yeah, and I mean, like, look, like, you know, people are going to have arguments one way or the other about which is the best way to fight a war. And, you know, that's kind of been a thing that's gone down through the ages, and that's all fine and good. But the thing is that when people look at, like, say, Gramsci's idea of the war of position, they receive that idea as something Gramsci came up with.
Yeah. It's not like a thing he just read in a fucking book, you know?
Yeah. They receive it as something isolated from the entire history of strategic discourse. So like, you don't get the perspective that you need on what Gramsci is saying because it seems like war of position, war of maneuver are Gramscian terms when they're just terms to describe two different ways of fighting a war.
They're trivialities of another, and they're terms of art that are basically trivial from another field. And if you showed that stuff to somebody from that field, like, I don't know, somebody who's gone through basic training or whatever, they'd look at it and be like, oh yeah, it's bullshit. And like they could tell you it if you just asked them right now, like today, you could do that. But if we treat this stuff as special in its own right, we're barking up the wrong fucking tree completely at that point. It's crazy.
Right. Like the problem is that, like, when this term becomes occulted and turned into a special Marxist term, you lose the conversation that it was a part of, and the conversation that continues going on long after Gramsci died. So then it just becomes this kind of like, well, we're a position. Gramsci said that we're Gramscians, so we got a Gramsci, and so that's a really that this is just a good example of what Davenport's talking about, in terms of, like, this is a rule of thumb that doesn't get examined because of disciplinary boundaries and because of this kind of, like, specialization of Marxism.
So self-recursive fucking folklore bullshit, yeah. But then the folks who are on the other side of that then are Bogdanov and Bazarov, right? Like, we're really trying to push the other way. It's like, no, the shit isn't special. We should be disseminating technique and technical specialty. We should be making technique not a specialty. Really upskilling the workers, like improving everyone's fucking lives and that sort of stuff. All the good stuff, you know, all the good stuff on the other side of that. One side of this debate didn't win. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, so the idea here was that, like, Bolshevism should be led by worker intellectuals, not specialists in theory, capital T theory, or capital M Marxism. Bogdanov believed that a cultural revolution that created new modes of thought, art, production, architecture, etc., was necessary to create the foundation for a socialist society and must be concurrent with the political revolution. So these are Davenport's words. Critically, what Bogdanov brings to the table is that the merger between socialism and the working class is not the ideas of self-appointed revolutionaries being adopted by workers, but rather the skills and knowledge of the intellectuals becoming the property of the working class acting for itself. And if these skills and knowledge are to become the property of workers instead of specialists, they must be translated into common language instead of the language of specialists. So the language of specialists would be something like, you know, just like throwing out like, oh yeah, the war of position. And it's like, well, what does the war of position mean? Well, it means this very specific thing that Gramsci meant, and you should know that. As opposed to like saying, oh yeah, like the war of position, war of maneuver, like just here's two really basic examples of how people have fought wars of maneuver versus wars of position. Here's the Blitzkrieg on one hand versus, you know, trench warfare in the First World War on the other. It's like, boom. It's just really comprehensible, but instead it becomes a very kind of like specialist thing about the way in which the struggle of activists can happen within a society towards revolution, which is like, that's fine, but it's worth noting that this is an analogy to a much more easily tractable concept. So you know, really what Bogdanov and Bazarov were aiming towards was pretty much on the same page as the Unity of Science people from the Vienna Circle, which was a circle of philosophers who were also really influenced by Ernst Mach back in Vienna, and who advocated something like ordinary language philosophy. And this went on to become analytic philosophy.
The good kind of philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we should like talk about this subject some more in the future, because I don't think we're ready to talk about it right now. But I think it's worth re-examining analytic philosophy and sort of like what's the value of it in these kind of terms that Bogdanov is talking about, and you know, what are the limitations of the way it exists today, right? So I feel like we need to get like Lexi on here to talk about this stuff, right? Like. Anyway, so So yeah, again, avoiding basically like Hegelese or Lacanianisms or, like that kind of stuff where it's like, yeah, maybe Lacan had a valid point about something, but do we need to know the Lacanian language in order to gain that insight?
Absolutely
I don't
not.
think so, right? Like there was
It has to be decoded and extracted from the weird frog theory, wizard speak kind of bullshit, and like recouched in terms that are actually familiar and transparent. Like there's this the kind of the upsetting thing about the continental kind of tradition is that there are some like really good and useful ideas in there, but they're buried beneath layers of just fucking bullshit.
Right, and the way that like it was really sold to me when I was sort of brought up in the continental tradition was like, look, the analytic philosophers are just like sticks in the mud who are like, obsessing over linguistic trivialities. We are like real philosophers who like have individual developed critical thinking and a tradition of like answers to difficult questions, and we're dealing with real life problems, not like whatever is the vase on the table, right? Like those kinds of like
Yeah.
those analytic philosophy bangers, like
classic. Yeah. Oh fuck.
But, behind that, to a certain degree, I think it is fair to say that, like, it is about developing a consciousness as, like, initiates in a tradition of occult knowledge.
Mm-hmm. It's a mortal fetish for stylistic novelty as well, just taken to its terminal fucking degree. Yeah, but that then is contrasted with like there's a couple of really great lines coming up in the article here of like that to quote like the single most revolutionary act an intellectual in the socialist movement can do is to make scientific theory and philosophy more accessible to the masses. To which I say, yeah, big fucking round of applause for us. We're really doing it.
We're trying.
Yeah, we're trying.
We're really aren't we the greatest revolutionaries? No.
Look, you said it, right? We're gonna have to be honest about this. Yeah.
We didn't write this article. No, I don't know how true this is, but like there's a kernel of truth to this, right? That like basically like taking knowledge that is peculiar to your discipline or to your tradition or whatever that has value and communicating it in plain language that an average person can understand. It is like a step towards sort of the abolition of this technical domination. And you're doing something that it's kind of working in the opposite direction to this idea of, the sort of Althusserian theorist in his high tower leading the revolutionary movement.
This is something I definitely have to work on, like especially with the cybernetic stuff. I think partially because there's definitely parts of it that I haven't fully digested yet, and like I find myself tripping over like terminology and stuff, and I can tell that the other person isn't really getting it, and I'm like, this is a sign I have to work a bit harder on just boiling this down. And stripping off whatever is extraneous to it.
Yeah, and it's not an expectation that you can communicate anything in a short conversation. It's more about like developing ways of presenting these ideas that can be kind of disseminated broadly and can get people on the same page without taking an enormous amount of time out of their lives, right? Like you don't need to spend four years to go understand the basic concepts of this field. Yeah, so that's nice. So again, Davenport says the role of the revolutionary intellectual, insofar as they are revolutionary, is self-abolition. Under capitalism, this won't result in the end of the social division of labor. This means that the working class movement must fully embrace cultural revolution.
Now we're on to the big words. What's this cultural revolution bit about?
Yeah, so cultural revolution is obviously something we're all familiar with from Chinese history. I mean, most of us probably are. It was a rather violent episode in Chinese history, to put it lightly. So you can kind of think about like, well, you know, I had that conversation earlier about sort of like, well, like lording my my specialist knowledge over students in the classroom. Whereas, you know, during the Cultural Revolution, the students would have just murdered me.
Yeah.
And used my blood to write slogans on the wall. So
extremely metal. Yeah.
I was very metal. I was also incredibly traumatic for Chinese society, and it has kind of become like a bit of a boogeyman, right? Like like it is this specter that haunts contemporary China. Like it, you know, any sense of like the fear of disorder is the fear of another cultural revolution. The Cultural Revolution also involved things like Hanification, right? Like the suppression of cultural minorities, the destruction of traditional Chinese culture in the name of revolutionary culture. So, for example, like, you know, something I'm familiar with is a lot of like sort of masters of martial arts being killed or exiled or suppressed, being unable to teach anymore because that was old Confucian culture, and the new culture would not have any use for that sort of thing. So you can kind of see how like there were elements of what they were doing that kind of map onto the argument here in terms of destroying special knowledges and that kind of thing. But really, the Cultural Revolution as a concept actually got started with Bogdanov and the Prole cult.
Outstanding name for a thing.
Yes. Very good name. It was an organization that tried to organize a new approach to every aspect of life that would promote emancipation and break down the social division of labor. But unfortunately, this was at odds with the Soviet government, whose power depended on a monopoly of organizational knowledge. Specifically, its ideas were really opposed by Lenin and Trotsky. Lenin, you know, notoriously was really quite old-fashioned in his attachment to bourgeois culture and desiring to like reproduce bourgeois culture, and then of course. Yeah, and, you know, like bourgeois literature, bourgeois music, bourgeois architecture, and you know, Stalin obviously ramped that up with a little bit of Tsarism sprinkled on top. So this avant-garde was trying to go in a different direction, which is where you get things like, you know, like Vertov's like Man with a Movie Camera. And that kind of stuff, right? It was a new culture,
new proletarian culture specifically, right? Like the development and acceleration of proletarian culture instead of the imposition of classical culture or bourgeois culture.
And you know, like arguably, like through like after the 60s, like there was a period between like the 60s and the 80s where you could say like America was much more successful at achieving this than the Soviet Union was, right? Like with the development of like, you know, everyone wearing blue jeans and rock music and all that kind of stuff. Like it was a break with bourgeois culture that the Soviet Union attempted, but then that was suppressed. So the relationship with Mao's Cultural Revolution is a little bit unclear, but you know, one thing that was sort of characteristic about what Mao did was like, it was a lot more top down, and it was really focused on the cult of personality around Mao, which was not a thing that happened with the Prole cult in the USSR. And the Prole cult also was not about cultural homogenization. They did things like So it says, where the Red Guards burned classical art, the Pearl Cult developed new textile patterns and furniture for the enjoyment of workers. So again, you can kind of think about this as pretty similar to like the Bauhaus in the West, right? Like that sort of art studio that developed like, you know, the plastic chairs that we all sit on in classrooms these days and that kind of stuff, right? It was developing new forms of architecture, new forms of art that were very like much oriented towards like this kind of social development. And yeah, finally, there were some positive sides to the Cultural Revolution that can be pointed to, like the Shanghai Commune was very radical and avant-garde. And then they also had these barefoot doctors that went around the country and basically like, yeah, tried to, you know, I guess in a kind of similar way to like Cuban doctors are famous for, like not using their craft skill to develop a social privilege, but instead to help the people.
Indeed. Which brings us on to the, I guess, final section on constructive socialism. We are finally kind of introduced to the figure that's been shadowed in the title of the essay, Prometheus, and a sibling god, Hephaestus. And it's basically that, like, Prometheus was the one who stole fire from the gods explicitly to give it to humans, so as to, like, explicitly bring an end to the Olympian tyranny of those fuckers up there in heaven lording it over us. Whereas Hephaestus is a kind of engineer god who, like, builds a bunch of cool shit but gives it to the gods, like, for their own use. And there's a quote here then that the revolutionary scientist must be a Promethean and reject the path of Hephaestus. They must be willing to give up everything so that mankind might stand upright against those who would dominate it and lord over it. Tyrants must all be cast down, be they capitalists, technocrats, or warlords. Insofar as a communist ought to have faith, it is in the liberation of Prometheus from his chains and the toppling of the Olympian order. Yep, 2 thumbs up. That's good stuff. Really good.
Yeah, definitely. So, you know, the key thing about Hephaestus is that, like, he specifically ends up, like, having his stuff used by Ares, the god of war. And, you know, I think that's pretty relevant for engineers and tech workers in America. You certainly can see, right? Like the way that the Pentagon kind of drives technical development is a very Hephaestus sort of paradigm.
Absolutely, yeah. You can definitely see that tension in in Norbert Wiener's writing, right? Especially the human use of human beings, where he's like deeply concerned because like he has this like Promethean bend, right? Like he really wants to do the Prometheus bit, and he's like deeply concerned and afraid of how the kind of new technologies and even the understanding of cybernetics is going to be used by the state in this Hephaestan sort of way. Mm-hmm. Yeah. We gotta all don't build shit for the gods. Fuck them. Steal all their shit and bring it down the mountain. Just loot those motherfuckers and take all their stuff. It's really good. The term constructive socialism is then proposed here. It's a thing that's present in a lot of socialist thinkers, like it's present in James Connolly, Eugene Debs, and so on. But the author's putting forward constructive socialism as a kind of alternative to the term scientific socialism, because I think the constructive bit is a bit more of a kind of like, no, you just go and do. Like it's not just scientific analysis; it's this construction of a new world, which is pretty sweet. Do you want to run through then the seven bits or 7 components that this thing needs to have?
Yeah, sure. So constructive socialism, according to Davenport, would have 7 components. So the first one is cultural revolution, which is, again, overcoming this kind of social domination through knowledge and creating a culture and a world of art that can be shared by everyone. The replacement of management by initiative with a community of shared interests and a culture of comradely cooperation. So community of shared interests, we didn't talk about too much, but it's basically about like, you know, building shared interests among groups of workers, which didn't necessarily come to light earlier. So like, you know, if you want to unionize a workplace, like, by default, the workers might just be like grousing about how miserable their job is and not really see the possibility of a shared interest. So it's kind of about like making that potentiality realized.
It's
right?
specifically constructing coordination and cooperation structures which would not occur stochastically otherwise. Like they're not going to occur of their own, so they have to actually be built. That it requires intervention. This is not the sort of naive accelerationist thing of like, well, if we just let the tendencies do their thing, then we'll end up in paradise. It's like, no, you've got to actually do work to make this shit happen.
Right. And the comradely cooperation, that's about, not hoarding knowledge, lifting other people up, finding ways to kind of like subordinate your particular interest to a solution that is going to help everyone. So that's kind of the comradely cooperation, which gets back to that sort of like Taylorism for socialists angle that this article has. And then there's the breakdown of the division of labor and the upskilling of members of socialist organizations. We already talked about that. The combination of education and practical work to the highest degree possible. So this is, again, kind of like doing what Dewey wanted to do, but like a little bit in that kind of balanced way that he was aiming at, right? Where it's not just like let them go off in the weeds. It's not just teach the theory. It's not teach object lessons with no context. It's kind of like whenever you are teaching something practical, you should include a theoretical component to say like, well, one of the examples here is like, well, the reason we're doing this community garden is because of X, Y, Z, these like reasons that capital is dominating us and what like, like, for example, like we've got a food desert. Well, why do we have a food desert, right? Like, why can't we get fresh food in our area? And why do we need to make this garden? And then you can give a little bit of an analysis of that, right? Just so that when you are teaching theory, there's a practical dimension. And when you're teaching practical skills, which, the author Davenport says is like something that the left doesn't do enough. There's too much like sort of like, let's chat about philosophy night or let's have a lecture about the greatness of Trotsky. And not enough skill building, make sure you include some useful theory in that. Then there is the scientific selection and training of cadre. So Shane briefly mentioned this. This is the idea that like you want to use like the IWW's framework for activists. Well, I guess we'll include a link to it in the show notes, which they basically have like a kind of like Taylorist quantified approach to essentially grading people according to how much they speak in favor of the cause and how much they actually act in favor of the cause. And if those two things come together, then they're like the highest ranked. And if you have one but not the other, you're a little bit lower. And if you're just actively hostile to both, you're on the bottom, right?
And so the point being you don't just sort of like look at the shop floor as it is right now and go, well, this place is a little bit disposed to the union or a little bit indisposed to it. No, you identify the most advanced and the most regressive sort of sections, and you actively cultivate the people who are in your favor and who matter, and you actively isolate the ones who aren't. Like just you engage on that level of like, and you like cultivate people. It's like, okay, this person's quite in favor of us. Let's get them fucking in and get them doing and get them participating. Get them up the ranks there. This other person is like really trying to sabotage us. Let's like actively block them and get them the fuck out of here.
Yes, and you continuously revise these assessments, right? Because like one thing that Taylor would do is he would take like a worker and train that worker in the new method of work. And then once that was done, which could take quite a while, he'd take like a little bit of a larger sample group. And then you kind of like broaden it out as you keep working until eventually everyone can see the efficacy of the new method in the workplace. And so the minority that's hostile will basically go over to the new method because the preponderance of opinion in doing things the old way is overcome. And this is not just about indoctrination. It's about training in skills, and it's about those object lessons to like show like, no, this actually works, right?
Indeed.
Yeah. Yes. So the next one is focus on organizing the unskilled sections of the working class and winning skilled labor to its camp rather than the treating of them as identical. So saying like, instead of saying like, oh yeah, the unskilled workers and these like quote unquote petty bourgeois or, PMCs or whatever you want to call them are identical because they're all workers, recognizing the difference between the two and kind of strategizing on that basis. And then the development and advancement of a universal organizational science. So again, this would be like unified science, systems theory, that kind of stuff, basically bringing that to everybody. And we were kind of like looking at the syllabus, right? This new effort that Morozov's spearheading in terms of like trying to like get the best information and make that easily available to people, right? And it's kind of like they also mentioned in this article, Davenport mentions in this article how like you want to kind of get little bits of science from everywhere and cohere that into a worldview as opposed to siloing everything off into specializations. And once you've kind of cohered that information, then you can have that shared by everyone and develop like a scientific worldview. And, it's quite interesting because like, in a way, like, sort of growing up, I found, generally speaking, that like people who are petty bourgeois were more skeptical of the scientific worldview than most workers I talked to.
Yeah.
Because like there's kind of a legacy of like that sort of like Newtonian science or like, the Promethean idea of science that's like hanging around. Maybe that's not the same anymore, right? After all the legacies of postmodernism. But when I was growing up, it was very much the case that I would go to college and, all my professors were teaching me about, to be skeptical of science because of like XYZ. And, I was learning my Derrida and so on and so on. And then I'd go back home and I'd talk to people, workers and stuff there, and they'd be like, what are you talking about? This is nonsense. Like,
science is cool. Yeah.
So, it's kind of about like developing a sophisticated scientific understanding that's aware of contemporary science. It's not just like, popular Newtonianism, uses systems theory and that kind of stuff. But that is something that can be shared in general as a part of like a new culture.
Indeed. Good stuff. This is a really good read. I felt this is pretty much right up our alley. I think there's probably some kind of caveats, like stuff like be really careful with the Taylor stuff, and we should be careful with like just treating these things in purely instrumental terms. Like, I think we should lean on our Feinberg there, and be like, be careful what the technical code does, and so on. But, like, I think that the thrust of this is just so good. And, like, as I was reading through it, I found myself just nodding along in that kind of way of, like, when you read something that's kind of expressing your thoughts, but more cogently than you could, it's like, oh, this is kind of what, this is exactly what I've been thinking, but just written better, It's great. It's real good, And maybe Beer is a better thinker to draw from rather than Taylor, but like I think I take the author's point up front that they're like, hey, look, this is contrarianism. I'm going to be contrary in this article, and also like they do excavate something very worthwhile from it. It's not like it's not a wasted exercise, but like I think maybe somebody further along, like getting into the realm of Beer and Ashby and these kind of folks is maybe the place to be drawing more from rather than just Taylor, right?
Yeah, I think the thing that really stood out for me looking at this like Taylor stuff in detail, because there are some like fairly long quotes from Taylor in this essay that we've kind of skipped over, is just like there's some specifics about teaching that come out in there that I didn't really like, because I haven't read enough Beer, but they're just kind of like things that were very unintuitive to me as somebody who was brought up in an education system that was very much reproducing privileges.
Sure.
And like monopolies of knowledge. So like, I mentioned before the whole thing about like sort of throwing people in the deep end and asking them to swim. But another thing that like, I really found as a teacher was like giving specific tasks. It's like there's a certain part of me that like rankles against that of like, here's your enumerated list of tasks to do. And you do the tasks and don't think about it too much and blah, blah, blah. But really, I guess practical experience has shown me how like giving specific tasks does sort of give people a yardstick by which to measure what they're doing, and kind of like come back to their objective and check what they're doing reflexively and recursively, to kind of try to improve what they're working on, instead of just keeping it super open-ended.
I think of that stuff like it's because it's very like the productivity advice to like just use a to-do list or something, or just like a sheet of paper with stuff on it. It's outboard cognition, right? Like it's the way we externalize parts of our cognition in like external tools such as checklists, to save ourselves the sheer effort of remembering everything. And so, yeah, on the one hand, like giving somebody a list of things to do, or like it feels like domination. It feels like narrowing their scope or whatever. But it also kind of alleviates the like the burden of like figuring everything out on your own from scratch every day. Like that whole thing of like sink or swim stuff, like you were talking about, like of like, oh no, I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm just going to let you fucking drown yourself. Well, maybe give me the fucking life raft. Like that might be nice.
Right. Well, I think the concern is like every class gives you a very specific list of things to do, and then when you get into like you get out of school, and you have to set objectives for yourself. So, for example, like as a doctoral student, I went into an extremely unstructured environment. This was like the ultimate example of this approach to teaching, right? Was like I got into the doctoral program at Kyoto University, and they basically said, okay, you got 3 years, go write a doctorate. Here's the library. Here's people you can contact if you want to talk to someone, go for it. Right. And, I sank. I didn't swim, yeah. I sank. Totally. It's having come up in a system where things were a lot more structured than that, and then going into a radically unstructured environment was a very difficult transition. And so, like, I can kind of understand, like, when you get to that level as like a high-end researcher and like you're operating on the cutting edge of research, it's not obvious what the task is. And so formulating those objectives is important. And that's no less true in many other fields of work. But I guess there is like a kind of bridge between these two positions, which, many sort of like graduate advisors and stuff would be familiar with. It's just like, kind of following those principles that Dewey was outlining in terms of what makes a good education, right? It's like having the object lessons, being there to support, and like basically like fostering the skills instead of just like saying, yeah, figure it out.
Yeah.
You're a big boy now.
Raise people up, and then they can teach everyone else and so on. Yeah.
So I think that kind of like educational dimension of Taylor's work is really interesting. Even if like on the organizational side of things, I think Beer definitely has a lot more useful ideas.
But yeah, I definitely take the author's point here. Maybe like being contrarians about this is the right way to go. Like, let's look at like bourgeois fucking management science and all this kind of stuff. And in the same way that Eric Olin Wright asks us to look at bourgeois sociology and take it seriously, we should be taking all this other stuff seriously as well. If only that like we could read it and then be like, oh no, this is crap, and then write it off. But we have to actually fucking read it first, and like don't just take fucking Trotsky's word for it or whatever. That you know?
Well, the thing is, like, if we were to just stick within the boundaries of Marxism, like, you know, obviously that work is chronically under-resourced. So there's a pretty good chance there's some other ideas happening elsewhere that are worth checking out instead of just kind of like, you know, reproducing scholasticism.
Yeah, absolutely. Indeed. Yeah, I think on that note, we can probably wrap it up unless there's anything else you'd like to talk about.
No, I think that's about it.
Fabulous.
Yeah, just kind of go through the outro.
Indeed. Yeah, thanks, listeners. It's been great. It's great to be back properly for a brand new year. While you're waiting for the next episode, which we don't know what it's going to be, but anyway, while you're waiting, you can catch us on Twitter @GIUnitPod. We're on Facebook. You can get us on the internet, generalintellectunit.net. You can go to patreon.com/generalintellectunit. If you throw us a couple of bucks a month, you'll get access to our community Discord, which is really great. In fact, I think the author of this piece is from our Discord. That's probably how it was brought to our attention in the first place when it was released. So yeah, really great community. If you want to rub shoulders with folks like this, it's the place to be. I still feel like I'm forgetting something from the outro. I need to actually write this down. Is that everything?
There is, of course, the Patreon.
No, we did the Patreon. What's the other?
We did the Patreon, and then
Emancipation.
I thought I should. Yes, Emancipation Network. We are part of the Emancipation Network, and probably should mention that we've been getting ready to launch a new podcast, Jumpsuit Utopia. Which is something a little bit lighter. It's a Star Trek podcast, but we're covering all the different series of Trek. We're talking about Picard, and we're doing that from a communist perspective. So we kind of analyze different episodes of Trek with the lens of communist theory and communist concerns. So, like, what kind of utopia does this present? How plausible is this? And, like, what does this say about sort of our attachment to Trek? Mm-hmm. But, like, what does it also say about what utopianism might look like? So it's kind of a futures focus, and it's quite a bit of fun. We've had some TNG, we've had some DS9, and we're doing Picard, and that's all forthcoming.
And it's a kind of revolving cast of the Emancipation crew, so it's a little bit different every time. Those have been some really fun sessions, talking about our fully automated spaceless alienism.
Yeah, we've got people on there who are diehard Trekkies, and people who love some series and hate some others, and we've got people who have hardly seen any Trek before. So it's a nice spectrum.
Indeed. It's good stuff. And also, check out the rest of the Emancipation shows. Swampside Chats and From Alpha to Omega. They're excellent. We're going to be starting a new Alpha to Omega series pretty soon. Starting recording for that.
Yes.
Next month or two.
Yes. The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. So getting back to Marxist political theory, we're all hard at work studying our 19th century French history. So that we're not looking like complete fools in talking about the subject matter. But of course, this is an interesting book because it is sort of the purest example of Marx's method of political analysis.
I'm looking forward to that. I need to see if I can spare the time to actually get on the show. But even that, I'm looking forward to hearing it because it's something I'm not familiar with, really. Indeed. Cool. In that case, thanks, folks, again, and we'll catch you again in a couple of weeks. Bye-bye.
Bye.